So this is going to be a fairly brief presentation. It's called The Symbiotic Semiosis of Symbols in Society, or the Strange World of Biosemiotics. As for the presentation itself, as I said, it's not going to be a long one. The idea is having a brief introduction to biosemiotics, to what symbols are, to what semiotics is, and how we can talk about science altogether. My name is Claudio, and I work at the Department of General Linguistics here, teaching and researching biosemiotics for the most part, but also other things that if you ever come over, you'll find about, and hopefully you will come over and find out more about the things that we're doing here at the department. So let's get started. The things that we're going to talk about in this particular presentation are going to be in order. Concepts of when we talk about nature and when we talk about culture, why we think there's a distinction between nature and culture, and how that distinction plays out later on when we try to do theories about living beings and how living beings are also trying to use meaning in their environment. And we will move forward trying to understand how to perhaps put together concepts of nature and culture, how to reunite them. Then we'll move on to talking about what a sign is. In particular, this is important because biosemiotics and semiotics in general is the sort of discipline where talking about the concept of the sign is more than necessary. It is foundational to whatever it is that we want to say in semiotics. But there's a very important question that we have to address in this case, which is, why should we actually care? What do we do with semiotics that is actually relevant for us? So we'll try to clear that out as well in order to have an idea of why semiotics might actually be an important thing to care about, and why biosemiotics in particular is a relevant way to look at semiotics. So at the end of the presentation, we will talk about what semiotics could be considered as. Because the concept of semiotics is something that you hear very often. It's something that appears in people's vocabulary, but it never seems to have a proper definition. It doesn't seem to have this clear way of approaching the core of the ideas that we actually have in semiotics. So ultimately, what we want to talk about is how with semiotics, we can talk about both nature and culture. And one example of that is this image here about the intersection between culture, nature, and how we can put those things together. There's something interesting to say about semiotics, because very often we find ourselves just not having this idea that we know what the concept is, but we're not completely sure about it. So more often than not, if you've ever studied something like semiotics and you tell other people about it, they will perhaps not really understand. Maybe you'll hear people thinking you're studying symbolics or semantics or symbiotics. And so in a way, this presentation will come as a way to clarify what that distinction might be for everyone who is interested in dealing with semiotics. But the first thing that matters to us then is understanding first how we talk about nature and culture. Nature and culture, the ultimate showdown. We have this distinction between the things that happen in nature, and we seem to be clear about what is cultural versus what is part of nature, right? We tend to think that culture has a number of characteristics that are completely separate from the idea of nature. We tend to think, or at least we would call this perhaps the received view of nature as chaotic or self-ordered, as organic, as devoid of reason, that is the land of no rationality, where things happen without control. Whereas we consider culture as this constructed, mutually organized group that is inorganic, that is rational. We put culture as this, we build the sense of culture that we have as a particularly stiff set of objects. And those objects seem always to be meaningful. But when you go to nature, when you put nature and culture as two different things, it seems that we see nature as opposed to culture. We see nature as having very little to do with the order of things that we find within culture, right? So nature is, there's a big value of entropy, let's say, whereas in culture, we have everything made semantically tied. Everything seems to have a meaning. Everything seems to have a reason for existing. The distinction that we have then between nature and culture will always seem to be part of how we understand ourselves. We understand ourselves through the idea of culture. We understand ourselves as opposed to nature. Even if we have some notion that humans are animals, we see other animals as devoid of this reason, of this capacity of making order. However, those ideas do not seem to be all that useful when we're trying to understand what is special about culture and how nature might say more than we actually think. Why do we even make the comparison between nature and culture? We are apparently conditioned to make this difference. We are culturally very successful in creating the idea of order, and we're very good at receiving this idea of order in nature, in culture, versus the disorder of nature. The chaos of nature then is completely opposed to how we want to present ourselves as cultural beings. Without going much further, you can find things as TV shows that try to portray how the world would look without humans, and how and they use concepts such as nature taking over or taking back what was theirs. And you can see those images of cities full of trees, collapsing buildings, and animals just moving around. And we contrast that to what we have. And there seems to be something that is meaningful about it, because we tend to perhaps block the idea that our constructions are also part of nature. There's when we try to understand the distinction between culture and nature, we have to find, or rather we do find, the things that seem to be much more relevant for us as humans in order to understand nature itself. But one thing that we do not see perhaps is that by putting culture as a different group of possibilities, we look at nature under the eye of culture, and we do not see how culture might actually be a result of nature. In fact, semioticians of the newer eras of semiotics, let's say, have tried to understand that nature and culture might be closer than we usually seem to think, that culture is a result of biological processes. This is why we actually want to care about why our conditioned view of nature versus culture may not give us a very useful set of interesting things to say about either of them. When we have the distinction between nature and culture, we try to make this distinction again based on the received view that we've had about what makes culture special, and yet by forgetting that many of the principles of culture are given to us because they come from nature. By forgetting this, we tend to foresee, or rather avoid seeing, the implications that nature has in how we construct our own cultural ideas. As biosemiotics becomes a thing, and we will talk more about this in a bit, as biosemiotics becomes a thing for a tool for thinking about things in nature and culture, we realize that the things that make culture stand out when faced with nature are not exactly the things that we think are that interesting. Nature as a disorganized set of processes is only disorganized insofar as we see it with a cultural point of view. But if we start thinking that the order, the making of order through culture comes from biological principles, then perhaps we can start seeing how those principles operate at different levels throughout nature. So, in a way, we want to understand then culture as related to nature. But in order for us to do that, we need to perhaps change the way we refer to the elements of culture altogether. So this is how we want to deal with the problem of culture first in order to get to nature. When we apply a semiotic point of view to culture, we need to reshape the concepts that we're using. We need to understand that perhaps culture is not given to us as a complete high-level bundle of information, but rather that it comes to us in specific, with specific concepts, with specific ways of us approaching culture, of us approaching nature, and of us approaching our own perceptual processes in order to understand what is around us. So semiotics tries to say something different about culture. And when we apply semiotic concepts to culture, we try to see perhaps what elements there are in culture that are actually more meaningful than others. So I think that it's important for us to understand more of what semiotics does, right? What is semiotics? Usually we call semiotics the study of signs, but this is not very informative because what is exactly a sign? We have a common sense notion of what the sign is supposed to be, but when we're talking about disciplines in the humanities, we also have technical concepts that do more work than just notions of what things are supposed to do. So for instance, you have seen all of this, right? This is a sign. This is usually a very common example for us to use as signs that in common parlance, the idea of a sign is this, basically. And this is a sign. There's nothing wrong with calling this a sign. But if you're trying to have a more specific way of approaching cultural objects, you may not want to call this just a sign. You may actually want to call it a symbol. And this is important for us because we need to start explaining what the technicality of signs might be and why we actually want to focus so much on signs. As you remember, I just mentioned that semiotics is the study of signs. This may be an oversimplification of what semiotics actually does, but it's also one of the most important concepts that we have at hand. When we are trying to understand the objects that surround us in a cultural setting, we're trying to divide and put together all of the things that signify to us. When you are faced with a stop sign or a pare sign or an alto sign or an arrête sign or a tomare sign, for instance, you will usually have the same reaction. All of them are stop. But the way we understand how this stop sign actually works for us may be different depending on where we are and what sort of sign we're actually perceiving. So we call this a symbol. And this comes from a particular set of concepts where we try to make semiotic ideas much clearer by dividing them into different categories. In the philosophy of semiotics, so to speak, we can find a very important division between different kinds of signs. So let's try to follow on the footsteps of previous semioticians who have tried to make this difference clear. Let's go with a number of examples about what kinds of signs we might be. For instance, we have here a footprint in New Mexico that was imprinted 23,000 years ago. And we have a 17-year-old painting in Lascaux But then we have a 32-year-old illustration of a 17-year-old in Tokyo, and a current Japanese character that traces its history to around 1200 before current era. We call this all signs. All of these are signs, but they are all different kinds of signs. For instance, here, what we usually call this is an index. An index is a sign that comes to us because of some causality, something that shows that something else was there. The most common example of an index is that of fire and smoke. Smoke is an index of fire. You don't need to see the fire in order to know that there is fire, as long as you see the smoke. In this case of the footprint, you don't need to see that there was a human being. You can perhaps deduce that, in fact, there was a human being walking around, though it could be the case that someone is trying to fool us and they just used a cast of a human foot, or it may have been a different kind of being, a primate with feet that look very similar to that of humans. The important thing, though, is that this is a mark left, imprinted, that reveals some causal connection between something in the past and something that we can see now. This is what we call an index. And one quick way to remember what indices do is to think of pointing. Remember your index finger. You are pointing at things when you see an index. When you have an index as a sign, as something that you perceive, that thing is pointing to something else. Then when I present this painting, this is a cave painting that is depicting animals. This is what we call an iconic sign. An iconic sign is much like when many icons that we see in our computers, they seem to represent things by way of similarity. The things that we see in the image illustrate things that we kind of know that exist, right? There's things here that apparently seem very similar to things that we've seen outside, things in the world. And there is a sense of similarity by way of how the picture seems to point to the other thing. So icons are signs of similarity, signs that seem to refer to something else because they look like them in some way or capacity. And this is also iconic of a teenager in Japan, though it might also have more characteristics. One important thing, though, is that as we are presenting signs, we don't need to say that a thing is just one sign. Signs may come in different ways. There may be, perhaps when we see this painting here in Lescaut, it's an icon. It presents a relation of similarity to the animals that the person who did this saw, but it's also an index of the fact that someone painted that. Every sign that we see has multiple aspects. So it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about indices, icons, and symbols, these are not just purely the thing that we are saying it is. They have multiple aspects. And in this case, this is also iconic. Newer illustrations are also iconic of things that we've seen in the past. They may also have some symbolic content to them, but for the purpose of simplifying things, we are going to call this an icon. And finally, just like the stop sign that we saw before, this current Japanese character, which means what, is also symbolic, completely symbolic, because there's nothing about this character that has anything to do in logical terms with the concept of what. Just like the concept of stop and the red image, the red symbol that we saw before, there's nothing that means stop necessarily. It's a convention. So symbols are signs of conventionality. And these are the three main types of signs that we have, all thanks to the work of Charles Peirce, who was a philosopher, chemist, and logician. And he developed this theory of how signs work. And this has actually helped semioticians a lot. This is one of the reasons why biosemiotics exists, in fact. So just to recapitulate what we've seen before, we're talking about indices, which are signs of causality, signs that point to something, icons, which are signs of similarity, and symbols, which are signs of conventionality. But we may ask, what does this really tell us about culture? We perceive things through science, or so semioticians want to believe. It seems to be the case that the things that we have around us are not given to us simply as full perceptual experiences, but rather that the things that we see in our world of perception, come to us or can be divided in signs, can be explained as signs. But it's also important to know that when we are also developing things in culture, we are creating things that come in signs. So culture can be considered a collection of signs with a specific structure. Of course, there's much more to culture than just saying that we have signs. But when we are talking about how we perceive meaning in our society, when we perceive the things that are meaningful to us in our society, in any sort of culture really, then we're talking about the experience of seeing signs, of perceiving signs. So as we try to deal with the concept of culture, whether we're trying to imagine it as adjacent to nature or as opposed to nature, we can try to understand perhaps that this vision is not practical, that instead we want to focus on how we are different by using signs, but how mechanisms through which we produce and consume signs, so to speak, may also be similar in other species. So culture displays a bunch of characteristics that are not only given to us in science, right? There are many aspects of culture that do not get explained just by saying that such a thing is a symbol. That if you're seeing a stop sign in the street, you can say that's a symbol, but that does not explain culture, right? With that objection in mind, we can say that perhaps in culture there are many more things like memory, exchange of information, creation of new meanings. And so we start seeing how perhaps culture works as a system, as a semiotic system, perhaps even. So in this sense, one of the things that help us as semioticians is trying to conceptualize culture in specific parts. We talk about the Semisphere as a way to conceptualize culture semiotically speaking, and we talk about the Semisphere as the organization, the system of in which culture is organized. The Semisphere we can imagine is a physical space in which a certain culture appears, in which there's an exchange of information, in which there's meaning being produced and consumed. The idea of the Semisphere comes from Russian, Soviet, Jewish, Estonian semiotician Yuri Lotman, who tried to think of culture as cybernetic systems. And culture for him could be presented under a series of concepts that could explain why there is culture, why there is change in culture, why there is information storage in culture. He thought that culture had always, as a system, had always a center. In this center, you would find the main language, the main canonical elements of the culture, the main aspects of literature, for instance. So if we think of the Czech semiosphere, you would find the Czech language at the center, standard Czech language, perhaps a Bohemian view of language instead of a Moravian view of the Czech language. You would also find the canon of literature, the canon of history, how we tell the current history of the Czech Republic. But in the periphery, you would start finding things that are not part of the canon. You will start finding language as being used on a day-to-day basis, not the official language or the standard language, perhaps language as it becomes permeated by English concepts, by German concepts, for instance, how we in our day-to-day life may borrow words from other languages to express different things. An expression that comes to mind is when people say, "Oh my God," when speaking in Czech. This may not be part of the center of the semiosphere, talking about the Czech semiosphere, if such a thing can be conceptualized, but rather we're talking about areas that are lying outside of the center. There's a periphery where expressions that are not that common in culture become alive. This periphery of the semiosphere slowly moves around the semiosphere, and it may even make it to the center of the semiosphere. So culture changes, and this is an important thing. Culture as a system is not stuck always in one way. Otherwise, we would be still living in the same culture that we were living 200, 500 years ago, which is certainly not the case. And we have evidence for that in how language has changed, but also how we think of our consumption of art, or even how we conceptualize different people. And beyond the periphery, the further away you get from the center of the semisphere, the closer you get to the boundary. The boundary is what separates conceptually a culture with the outside. The outside is where there's no culture, where there's chaos, where there's not meaning. Or so we want to see when we are part of a semisphere, right? As we try to understand what lies beyond culture, we can go back to the concept of nature. The important thing to remember is that as culture as a system, for semioticians, is an imperialistic system. It tries to stop the entropy of what lies beyond culture. We give meaning to what lies beyond culture, which in the case of nature, we think that nature does not lie within culture, but outside of it. So when we are faced with nature, we culturify it, so to speak. We see our forests, for instance, and try to understand them not as forests themselves, but as parts of our culture, or as things that say something about our culture. We organize things in culture, we give them meaning. However, this is a representation of culture. We have to understand that when we are talking about how we deal with science around us, there may be more to say about nature than what we think there is, because we are representing nature through the view of culture. And yet there may be more to culture than that. Nature is subjective. Nature works as a semiotic system by itself, and culture is a part of nature. So this is the biosemiotic view. In biosemiotics, you take what you have already seen from what we call semiotics and start applying it into a position that tries to understand nature as also using science. So biosemiotics enters the picture here as a way to understand that organisms, all sorts of organisms, are actually perceiving their world and trying to understand what's going on in the world, trying to understand that biosemiotics tries to understand how these organisms that are not human can also use signs. We try to reconcile nature and culture by assuming that all living beings have semiotic capabilities. We build within biosemiotics on the semiotic tools that we already have to understand how signs might be biological processes. And we see how other organisms are also building their own environment through signs. We can understand then that different organisms have parallel lines of parallel worlds that lie beyond what we think is culture. However we want to think of culture as a system, we know that its basis is semiotic to some degree. And the fact that this is semiotic, or rather that it's actively semiotic, it means that perhaps we can also conceptualize organizations of other beings, living beings, as being semiotically involved as well. One important thing perhaps to keep in mind is that what seems to separate us from other organisms in semiotic terms is that by having such a developed sense of language, we also have a very developed sense of usage of symbols. You may have a hard time trying to find symbols in the world of other organisms. If you remember what we were just talking about, symbols are not necessary relations between the meaning that you get from them and what you see. So there's nothing about a stop sign that tells you, yeah, this seems like a stop, it looks like stop, it means stopping physically. It's something that we've acquired by convention. This conventionality that becomes so much more complex when we use language, when we create works of art, may not be there when we're talking about the organization of smaller communities or living beings without our perceptual system and our linguistic capabilities. Yet we can still talk about how icons and indices are very much a part of their world. If all signs come to be analyzed within the same system, we can see what distinguishes us in a more philosophical way, in a more technical way, without having to give nature this culturified eye. Of course, it's always hard to put this into very specific concepts when you're just introducing it, but try to imagine, for instance, if you have a pet, how your pet may react to what you say, and how it may communicate with you. How much can you really say about what your pet knows of the world versus how much you think your pet knows about the world? When you're pointing to food for a pet, do you mean, does the pet understand food? Does it understand I'm being fed, or does it understand something completely different? We can analyze things semiotically by putting our understanding of signs in the forefront as a way to approach the problems that come from seeing the difference between nature and culture, but also by using the advantage that we have from understanding that nature and culture may actually be part of the same system, that culture is a subsystem of nature, not the other way around. And this is how we introduce biosemiotics, basically. Biosemiotics tries to study the basis of culture and of perception through the usage of semiotic concepts. And I think that's about it for the introduction to what biosemiotics does and how nature and culture are basically united in a sense of, in a conceptual sense. So we'll leave it here, and I hope that this very brief introduction to semiotics and to biosemiotics in particular has been useful for you, that perhaps it can tell you something more attractive about how we can understand the world and natural relations of meaning. Because at the end of the day, what biosemiotics does is it tries to understand the subjectivity of all sorts of organisms, the way they use meaning and the way they have an actual meaningful world. That meaning is not just for humans, but for all sorts of living systems. And that's about it for me. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you come visit us sometime soon and in the future. And we're always welcome to, well, we're always happy to welcome new people in our department. So thank you very much. And I'll stop now because we have more lectures to follow.